Okay, so hello, welcome. While everyone is still joining, let me just introduce today's live talk really quick. I'm Eloisa from Codacy's marketing team, and we're here to discuss code reviews. It's one of the most important aspects of today's software development workflow. Whether you're reviewing someone else's code, having your own code reviewed, creating an efficient process for your team, it can be stressful, it can be time consuming. So there's going to be a lot to unpack here, and we're looking forward to it. I'm here with Curtis Einsmann, an experienced software engineer with a special interest in code reviews. You may have heard of Curtis in his blog or social media with over 25,000 followers, or his new video course called Master the Code Review, and a new book coming out. I mean, so much going on, but we'll get to that in a few. And to complete our panel is our CEO and co-founder of Codacy. Here is Jaime, who will be interviewing Curtis and sharing some of his questions and experience as well in software development. And so, yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. And as always, we will save some time at the end of this session for a Q&A. And I'm sure our speakers are very excited to answer your questions. So feel free to use that Q&A button at the bottom to submit any questions as they emerge. So let's get started. I think many of us are here. I would love for our panelists to introduce themselves. So please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you, Eloisa. Thank you everyone for joining. We're still having everyone joining from in Zoom. I'm really glad to see we had a record number of signups for this webinar. So these things are building up, and so quite happy with this. We started this a few months ago as we saw an interesting opportunity to help and to provide context and shine a light in interesting stories. So we're kind of happy with this outcome. And so I'm your host. I'm Jaime Jorge. I'm CEO and co-founder of Codacy, and we have a really exciting session for you today. So today we're interviewing Curtis Einsmann, and I'm going to describe a little bit his progress and his experience, which is quite remarkable. Curtis Einsmann is a software engineer at Gumroad, previously spent 6 years at Amazon Web Services. And at the start of his career, he really focused on improving code reviews. He participated in more than 1,500 PRs throughout his career at AWS and Gumroad. And his last year at AWS shipped 90% of his PRs in the first review. So he has helped so many of his peers level up and earn promotions through his feedback. Through this experience, he started writing tons about code reviews, and today has over 25,000 followers across platforms, exactly as Eloisa mentioned. He created a video course, Master the Code Review, in February 2022, with over 1,000 individual licenses and 30 company licenses sold. And all this experience is culminating in a book on code reviews coming in next year. So quite happy to have you here. Welcome, Curtis. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. That was a stellar introduction. You really did well there. I really appreciate that.
We're getting better in these things, but it's really easy with your background. So
yeah,
it's great to have you here. I guess my first question, and to kickstart this webinar, is what motivated you to start creating your own content about code reviews?
Yeah. So when I first, I started my career as a software development engineer at Amazon Web Services about 7 years ago now. And it was something that I really struggled with in the beginning, right? So I would author some code, I would open up a pull request at Amazon. They called them code reviews. I would get a lot of feedback on it, maybe more than I was expecting. Sometimes I would get 50 or more comments on it. I would address those comments, open up another revision, get another 30 or more comments. And it was, the feedback was kind and friendly, and my teammates and mentors were helpful, but it was kind of a struggle. Sometimes I shipped late. Sometimes it took me 7 or more revisions to ship my code. Also early on, when people sent me some code to review, I didn't know what to look for. I'm like, okay, what am I really supposed to be looking for here? Didn't know how to give good, actionable feedback to my peers. And I just remember going through the day-to-day struggles and challenges of trying to get over that hurdle. And so I ended up learning, and I ended up getting more experience, learning through trial and error. Eventually, as you mentioned, I was able to ship my code reviews faster and also help my peers level up through feedback and actionable feedback. So it was a problem that I struggled with, and I created the course. I wanted to create it for my younger self. I left Amazon last year, became like a freelancer, and I'm doing a lot of work with Gumroad as well right now. And that gave me a little bit more time and control over my project choices. And I wanted to revisit this, code review problem that I had in the past. And I've been writing on the internet online for about 2 years. As you mentioned, grew my platform to more than 25,000 followers across platforms. I wrote on a variety of different software engineering topics, some system design here and there, some leadership skills, and then also code reviews. The code review pieces tend to get more shares, more engagement, more views, that sort of thing. So it was, I saw that as an opportunity to, maybe people aren't talking about this enough, this critical thing that we do every day. People aren't talking about it enough. And that's what motivated me to really go all in on this specific niche.
That's great, and I think you've hit a nerve. Obviously, we're quite also happy, fortunate to see that firsthand in our own company. But I think that's great that you've decided to focus on that. And I'm sure many teams and many developers face the same problems. And I guess what can teams do? Actual insights, tips that you can provide to create a better code review process. If you were to give some tips to our audience, what would you say?
Sure. I think, there are problems that happen in code review processes and pull request review processes that a lot of developers see, but nobody is really kind of calling them out or really trying to solve them. Sometimes people kind of, think about code reviews in a simple way. It's like, okay, I have some code, I review it, I comment on it, and then we ship it, right? But there are a lot of problems that kind of crop up that are very common. So for example, there are long discussion threads going back and forth. There are sometimes, code review cycles take more and more revisions than they need to. Maybe some deteriorating relationships are happening as well. Like teammates aren't collaborating effectively or, being friendly and kind to each other. And a lot of these things matter. And a lot of these things are very difficult to measure, right? It's kind of, I kind of compare it to code readability. It's very difficult to measure how readable your code is, but we all know that if code is unreadable, if has some convoluted logic, it's very, very difficult to develop features on top of it, right? And similar to a code review, there are all these qualitative problems that we don't necessarily objectively measure, but we know they're there and we know we can solve them, right? So I would say a better code review process is one that enables your team to ship functional quality code and ship it with speed and fast so that customers can get their hands on it and like start using it, right? So the first thing is, you want to automate as much as possible, automate where reasonable. So a really easy example of this is style. You want to have automated linters or formatters to make sure all of your code base stays with a consistent style. There are all kinds of automated tools out there that can scan your code, static code analysis tools that can scan it for security vulnerabilities, best practices, things like language best practices, whether using Java, Python, Ruby, whatever that is. Making sure that there's no debugger statements left in the thing, or, system.out.println, those kinds of things. So automate where reasonable, so that code reviews are as easy as possible. And also after that, after automating what you can, like the tests and approval requirements and so forth, you want to make sure that you set expectations. It's all about setting expectations for the team as well as the author and reviewer. So the main two actors in a code review are the code review author, code review reviewer, and setting expectations on the author's side. And these expectations can be documented maybe in a team wiki. At Gumroad, we use like a Notion doc. We just document all these expectations. So on the author side, what exactly should be in a pull request. What should the description look like? What should the anatomy of that description look like? I like to, PR templates work really great for this. Um, uh, Depending on the team and the product and the organization, you're going to want different things. But for me, it's all about, usually it's all about the what. Like, you want to include the what, like in terms of the product level, what's the impact this code change is having on the product? And you also want to have the why, which is selling, what problem does this code change intend to solve? And so those are the main two things in there. Some teams want screenshots, some teams want certain edge cases like rollback safety, backwards compatibility. Sorry, this is like a long-winded answer, but just going through it in detail here.
It's a tough question.
Yeah. So those are so setting the expectations on the author side, and also setting the expectations on the reviewer side, what you want the reviewers to comment on, how you want them to comment, being kind, making suggestions, always giving a reason why, and also getting to a code review fast, because it's very important. The author is waiting for review feedback. They're working on this task. They need to ship this task. So, time constraints of when to get to the code review as well. So just setting those expectations on both the author and the reviewer side for, documentation. And I think that's most of it. There are other things outside of the actual code review itself, like just kind of driving down some of those subjective disagreements that code reviewers may have. So, for example, there are all kinds of different principles that exist out there in the software engineering world. So, for example, the author of Clean Code says, okay, functions should be small. We should break up these functions into, bite-sized chunks. The author of A Philosophy of Software Design, a different book, says, okay, if you break up your functions into small chunks, then you're going to have different levels of abstraction. You're going to have different pieces of code that are dependent on each other, and your code and your readers are going to have to keep jumping around back and forth, right? So these are two influential people that disagree on this particular principle. So many of these principles are subjective. So just kind of having some documentation for your team that says, okay, these principles exist. These are the ones we agree with, and why, because everything's a trade-off. So it doesn't eliminate all subjective discussions within a code review, but it does wonders in driving those down.
These are excellent. I want to just kind of summarize for our audience, as part of a better process, there's 4 things that Curtis was saying, giving it the importance it deserves, treating it as important as code readability, automate as much as possible, set the right expectations that are documented for the reviewer side, for the other side, not forgetting to be kind, and then follow principles with an opinion stated in the documentation. So just making it super clear for our audience today. And I guess, this triggers a question for me, how do you balance this formalism that we're putting in the process, these expectations, as you mentioned, with speed, with, I want to ship, I have a commit and a pull request here ready to go. Why am I waiting, right? How do you balance that? How do you motivate that necessity for the right process?
Right. I think it's important to teach your team to review effectively. I think it's important to identify the points of emphasis that reviewers should be looking for. So, for example, reviewers should approach the review understanding the trade-off between speed and quality. There's always a trade-off between speed and quality. It's probably the most common trade-off that software engineers will be making over the course of implementing coding tasks. And it's important, okay, for the reviewer to consider, okay, is the author optimizing for speed, or are they optimizing for quality? I mean, a lot of times, if they're optimizing for speed, the author should explicitly mention this as well, maybe in the pull request description. A lot of times, what I like to do in my personal pull request description, if I'm up against a tight deadline, I would say, okay, if I had more time, maybe I would explore doing more refactoring here, or maybe I would explore adding more test cases in this part of the app. But right now we're up against a tight deadline, and I'm trying to push this thing out, right? So I think those are also forms of expectations that should be, set at the team level and at the product level as well. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does.
Okay.
It's a tough question as well. So I appreciate that reasoning. And now connecting a bit on the individual level for developer that is working and just did set of commits, pushing a pull request. What do you see as the most common mistakes that people do while they're reviewing code for other teammates?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think nobody's really trained to be a good code reviewer, right? There's very little training out there in terms of like how to comment on code reviews. And I think this is where most of the mistakes happen, is like actually giving the feedback to somebody. I think a big mistake is being ambiguous, or not giving a reason why behind their piece of feedback. And a reason why is important because if you have a compelling reason why for your feedback, the author should just be able to take it in stride, understand it, implement it, and also not make the same mistake in the future, right? And if you don't give a reason why, you don't have a compelling reason for why you're giving that feedback, that opens it up to back and forth discussion and debate. And I think healthy debate is encouraged and should occur, but it shouldn't be necessary on every single piece of feedback, right? So not giving a reason why. I think a more objective mistake that I see in code reviewers, especially junior engineers, early career developers, is a lot of times they look at the code change itself and they look at the diff and they try to find flaws within the diff. So maybe there's an edge case, they look for edge cases that are missed, null checks that are missed, those kinds of things, which is good, which they should be checking for, but they also need to consider the code change within the context of the entire system, right? They need to consider the components it's impacting, the pieces of the product that it's impacting, and that takes some time. It takes a little bit of experience as well. So it takes some time of like sitting back and saying, okay, what other components will be affected by this code change, and are there side effects or other edge cases that I'm not seeing here just because they're not showing up in the diff? I think that's a common mistake as well. I think there are other very common mistakes that don't necessarily have short-term consequences or objective consequences. I think being unkind is a very common mistake. Giving commands or orders to other people, I think that is a long-term losing game. Deteriorating relationships. Code reviews are where a lot of soft skills and social skills come into play, and it's a primary method of communication between developers, and a lot of relationships can be formed here. So being unkind, definitely a mistake. And also not being thorough. This is the one that we've always seen, like maybe a reviewer on the first iteration of the review, they comment on lines 23 and 45, and then they fix it. And then on the next review, they comment, oh, like here on line like 67 and like 78, when they could have said that in the first iteration of the review. That just kind of like prolongs the cycle and prolongs the pull request. And these things happen all the time. I think these are things that we should talk about a little bit more, especially because it leads to cycles and it leads to reduced speed. Yeah.
Yeah, and such a big cultural part of the engineering teams, right? So I fully agree with you that talking more about these processes is important. A personal curiosity of mine, obviously, as we think about code review processes, what do you think are the major differences between code review in a company enterprise setting and code review in the open source? What have you seen that is dramatically different between these two settings?
That's a really good question. So asynchronous code reviews actually like originated from open source, right? So you have an open source project where you're committing and you're pushing code to this repository, and then you open it up to outside contributors, and these are people that you might not necessarily know. And so pull requests were kind of created as honestly like a gatekeeping or a blocking mechanism to prevent people you don't know from like adding to your code base without reviewing it first. And that practice has kind of transitioned into companies. Large companies do like a pull request workflow. And so that and so that migration shift kind of changes the mindset a little bit. So if you're maintaining an open source project, somebody else is coming in and trying to add code to your system. But you don't necessarily know this person. You don't necessarily trust them. It may also be true that you're not working with them for a long period of time. So the relationship is different, right? You don't have to focus on, maybe you don't have to focus on being kind as much, or maybe, you don't have to like really focus on building that relationship. But in a company, you're working with somebody long-term, and you're on the same team. It's not somebody that you don't trust. It ideally should be someone that you do trust. And so it's just a different relationship dynamic. You need to really focus on some of these soft skills and social skills if your team is going to participate in this code review process, where you're directly giving feedback on somebody's code. I always say, like, when you comment on the code review, you comment on the code itself. You don't comment on the person. So you don't use phrases like you or your, like, oh, you wrote this wrong, or you should have changed this variable name. So you comment on the code, like maybe this variable name should be changed, maybe this function should be rewritten differently. But you have to remember that there's a person behind that code, right? There's a person on the other side. And that's where the empathy comes in. And that's where the importance of building a relationship comes in, because you're working with this person every day. So that's a big shift I see. And I think I've seen the shift, like, if somebody comes in, I've seen people come into Amazon, for example, that are very big open source developers, very strong open source developers, and they come in, and I see these things that kind of trickle in, like maybe, maybe they're not as kind, or maybe the way that they're giving feedback to other people is very open sourcey, I would say, instead of like trying to actually build and mentor this person.
Yeah, no, that resonates a lot, and I think there's so many things about the code review process that are signals and indications of a healthy culture, or lack of a healthy culture, right? And so
Yes.
it's another question following up there. What do you think is the role of a manager in that process, in that code review process? What should or could a manager do to make sure that process is good?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think depending on the organization, the manager plays a little bit of a different role. Coming from the background that I know, a manager usually is in collaboration with maybe a team lead or a lead software engineer to kind of set the expectations of the team. So I think the manager should be very involved with, coming up and documenting with some of those code review guidelines that I was mentioning earlier. I think that a lot of times the manager isn't within the code, and maybe they're not reviewing code on a daily basis, or maybe they're not monitoring the code reviews and the discussions that are happening. I think it is a good idea for them to kind of like scan code reviews every now and then, just to kind of see like what the culture of the team is like, and maybe also talk to their engineers, keep that communication open during one-on-ones, and especially with the team lead software engineer, to say, hey, like, how are we doing with this process? Are you seeing anything? Just kind of keeping that communication open as well.
Love it. About communication. That makes perfect sense. And so as we think about, you, from your experience in digesting so many different processes, and can you offer any rules of thumb for a good pull request?
Yeah, definitely. I think good rule of thumb for creating a good pull request, a good pull request should be small. That's one thing I haven't mentioned before. Like, large pull requests are very difficult to review, and they also carry more risk when actually shipping those to production. But in order to create a small pull request as an author of an eventual pull request, your task size has to be small, right? So a lot of times developers, especially like junior developers, they're disengaged with the project management process. How are tasks broken down? How are tasks defined and estimated and scoped? And it's very important for developers to be active in that process, because, if you have a bite-sized task, it's much easier to produce a bite-sized pull request. And you won't get this right immediately. It'll take several, it'll take some learning and experience, but just being engaged in that process. And then there's the actual code, right? It has to cover edge cases. It needs to be at the right levels of abstraction. It needs to be logical, readable, tested. And that comes from just sharpening your sharpening the saw, like improving your craft over time. I personally like to read technical books that expose me to different mindsets and paradigms about how to develop software. And then there's opening the pull request itself. Of course, like I mentioned, like depending on the product and organization, you might want to have a certain level of detail, but it's definitely the what's and the whys. The why, making sure you're selling the problem and selling your solution about how you solve that problem and why that solution is the best way. It doesn't have to be like a lengthy, 3-paragraph thing. It really depends on the change. But just, selling the why and also selling the what, prove it, like documenting exactly at the product level how this works. And also a more actionable piece of advice is like, just your standard stuff, like don't open a pull request at the end of the day. You'll probably like just wait till the next day, sleep on it. Open it up in the morning when you've had some time to think about what you've done in the code that you've written, and also review your own code. So every time I open up a pull request, I review my own self in an internet browser, not necessarily in an IDE, because that change of environment gets me into review mode. And I can review it with a little bit more skepticism, and I almost always find a flaw or something that could be tweaked. Of course, it's good not to be. You don't want to be a perfectionist. Be pragmatic. But I think those are definitely some actionable tips that all developers should keep in mind.
It's excellent. Is there any time split that you recommend, or any kind of guidance that you would give in terms of how much time should a developer or a development team be spending reviewing code per week?
I don't know if I have an exact number. I think it really depends. I've worked on both like new systems and legacy systems. I think on legacy systems, it takes much longer because you have to account for all these different edge cases and components and code that's like 10 years old and side effects and everything. So it really depends. What I will say is that it always takes longer than you think. I think most people really underestimate how long it takes to review code. It's very hard. It's a very hard thing to do. And it takes a lot of like the 2 steps to like performing a good code review is like, first you have to understand the change, understand the code change, understand the product that's impacted. And then you have to and then you have to find flaws and also give good feedback to them. Right. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And it takes time. It really does. I've reviewed I think I tweeted about this once. I think I reviewed like a 10-line code change and it took me like an hour just because and this was like on a very legacy system. This isn't like the norm or anything, but it does happen sometimes because I had to it was impacting a very critical part of the system, and I had to read a lot of existing code to make sure it wasn't going to break anything. And I think on like minute 45 or something, I realized something. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this would be really bad, reviewing just takes a very long time. And teams should account for that in their estimations and project planning and things like that.
Fantastic. Any particular favorite tools that you use while engaging in the process of reviewing code? Is there anything that you recommend that you see teams having success with?
I would definitely recommend static code analysis tools. I think I've used a few different ones, but it really depends on the organization. But like whatever language you're in, whatever language you're writing in, there's going to be a static code analysis tool. There's going to be a formatter. So definitely integrate those. In terms of I don't use too many commenting tools. I think commenting is just something you have to, it's like written communication. And it's very specific to the pull request use case. So I don't really use any commenting tools or anything like that. The GitHub pull request interface is pretty simple, and it gets the job done pretty well for my experience. So yeah.
Got it. In terms of for us as individual developers, this is also a quest of improvement and learning, right? So much of this, as you mentioned, questioning the what and the why, and doing proper documentation for others to also grow in the process of reviewing code. So much of this is also us growing and learning and evolving. So
yeah,
what do you recommend? What tips can you give to, well, maybe likely junior developers, so that we can continue learning and evolving as software engineers?
Absolutely. Well, related to this topic, I think code reviews, like performing code reviews for others, is actually a great way to level up your skills and improve your skills and your learning. Because when you watch how other developers have approached a problem and solved a problem, it exposes you to different problem solving strategies that you can adapt and leverage later. And also, while you're reviewing this code, think about the why. Like, why did they choose to make that decision? Like, acknowledge that when they made this code change, they could have done it a different way, but they chose a certain way intentionally. And so why did they come to that conclusion that they did? That really helps a lot. Other than that, I'm pretty involved in like the tech Twitter sphere. I think social media is what you make of it. Like, you can choose to follow who you want to follow. And when you're scrolling and you're reading, you want to make sure you're like putting good, information into your brain. And there's a lot of good stuff out there. It's just, you have to really find it. So that's a good way to stay up to date. Tech Twitter, Hacker News, those kinds of things. And also reading deep technical books from somebody that has gone like all in on a particular subject. That really helps out for me. I mentioned some books like Clean Code, A Philosophy of Software Design. Refactoring is another one, Domain-Driven Design, and those kinds of things, as well as the soft skills. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I talked about today, code reviews are an example of a process in which soft skills and social skills are very much on full display, because it's all about collaborating with other human beings. And reading, for me, I like reading books on topics like leadership, like working effectively. A book is like 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Would highly recommend that. A lot of the principles come into play in a code review setting. So I really I like reading. Sometimes it's hard to find time to like sit down and actually read a book. So I a lot of times I listen to audiobooks as well. So I can, while I'm doing chores or while I'm driving or something, I can listen to the audiobooks.
Excellent. I was actually taking a quick look at our Q&A. It seems we already have a number of questions, which is quite interesting. And so I'm actually I love one of these, which is quite interesting for myself. A question from Elena Alves. Do you have an opinion about the statement, one mob/pair is always better than an async review?
Yeah, I think this is a very common question that I get. I actually wrote an article like comparing the two approaches. If would I agree with that particular statement? I wouldn't agree with that particular statement, but that's not a knock on mob programming or pair programming. I think like pair programming and an asynchronous code reviews, these are two different tools, and each organization should do what's best for them. I will say that there are advantages and disadvantages to both. Like for pair programming, the advantage is that, you have the reviewer right there and it's quicker iterations, quicker feedback. You have two people already looking at the code, so you don't have to wait, one on the other. Obviously the disadvantage is that the second programmer isn't able to like push another task forward, isn't able to work on their own task. I would say that one advantage that asynchronous code reviews has over pair programming that people don't normally consider is that an asynchronous code review brings in a reviewer who has never seen the code, and they're looking at the code for the first time. And this simulates a realistic environment of when you have a new developer onboarding to your team. Not everything's going to be documented. So they have to dive into the code. They've never seen this code before, and they have to understand it. And the reviewer kind of gets you a step closer to simulating that situation. Because sometimes, if you have two people that are like, thinking as an author, it's a different mindset to actually approach the code and think about it as a reader. Those are two different mindsets. It's comparable to, if you're writing a book or something and you have two co-authors, you're probably still going to hire an editor. It's a similar kind of mindset there.
Very cool. And with this, I mean, we're formally opening up the Q&A. And so if you have a question, send us out. I'll read it. Let's start with Russian Lopez Caro. Do you think code reviews can be automated someday? I'm guessing fully. What's your opinion?
I don't want to say never, because we've already like come to we've made leaps and bounds in terms of like what we can automate and what we can't automate. There are a few challenges that I see in terms of being able to automate code reviews. One of them is the human to human interaction, right? Like if you're giving feedback to somebody, that feedback is not always objective, and it's not always binary and a one or zero. So it's there's personality and audience to consider. Just in collaborating with other humans, there are a lot of like qualitative and subjective things that come into play. And I think another challenge will be, we have automated tests and we have, guardrails against us pushing something out to production that will break. But human beings, use software in a very scattered way, or like a very, it's very non-predictable. It's unpredictable in terms of like how human beings are going to use your software. And you have all kinds of different edge cases and side effects, and maybe there's still data in the database that isn't accounted for, and there's a lot of different hurdles that you have to go through in order to actually fully run a full test suite against every possible edge case or corner case that can exist out there. So I think there's always, for a very long time, there's going to be a human element to a code review process.
Yeah. In parallel to that, there's a race for AGI right now, which we don't know what's going to happen. maybe
Right.
That will affect everything, right?
Right, exactly.
Another question from Elena Alves: if you do not have automated code quality tools configured in your pipeline, is it valid to send notifications in a pull request to make it compliant with the tool that you are not using?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
So Elena is essentially asking if you don't have automated quality tools configured, is it valid to send notifications in the PR to make it compliant with the tool you're not using? It's also.
Oh, okay. So maybe they're saying like, okay, if you don't have automated quality checks, is it okay to comment on somebody's code saying like, oh, we should like improve this quality? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there are certain situations where you have an established code base, and maybe you want to enforce this particular opinionated structure or of the code that you want, or best practices that you want to enforce, but maybe you don't want to like rewrite the entire code base. Perfectly acceptable to kind of communicate to your team, and hey, can we start doing this going forward, or can we make this change for a quality adjustment? Absolutely. Absolutely a good pull request comment there. One thing that we do at Gumroad, which is which I like a lot, is we have documentation and like those code review expectations and guidelines to say, with new code, let's start doing it this way. Or like, I think one of the examples is there's an old database table called link, but actually a link is actually a product, and you can find all kinds of references in the code where it says link, and it's like referencing it as a link, but we want to say, hey, we want to use product in new code going forward. And that's a documented expectation in the code review guidelines. If it comes up in a code review, very appropriate to tell the author, hey, we need to change this variable name or this function name to match the domain.
Got it. So let me find another question here. So Ray Hillman asks, should a reviewer always make sure they check out the code, run it locally, and test the functionality?
I think it depends. A lot of times, like I'm a back-end developer, and a lot of times I can go through and like look at the test cases, the unit tests, the integration tests, make sure everything is covered. And a lot of times you can just check those tests and have pretty high confidence that you're not missing any edge cases. But if it feels like if you feel like you need to run the code in order to understand it a little bit more, then by all means, take that time to really understand it. I think the key to performing a good code review is make sure you understand the change, and make sure you understand the impacts of the change. And if you have to run that code in order to understand it, then definitely do it. Front end, especially like front end code, definitely, it's you want to get a feel for the UX and the design and how the buttons interact and the styling. Maybe you want to resize the browser window and test it to see if it's robust. I mean, definitely common use cases where you might want to actually run the code yourself.
Wonderful. Yuri asks, sending short PRs is good for the one doing the review, but thinking about the team workflow, it could also lead to some blocking issues. How can we avoid team blocking caused by incomplete features or small PRs?
That's a really good question. At the project management stage, you want to carve out those small tasks so that hopefully you'll end up with a small PR, but that doesn't always happen. Like sometimes there are, in order to make a certain change to an application, you really have to modify, many different components of the code because something will break, right? Maybe there's like a backwards compatibility issue or like a data normalization issue where like you really have to modify all kinds of places in the code. I think it's valuable to, sometimes large PRs are unavoidable. And I think this comes in like the pull request description of saying maybe you have this large PR and you say, hey, I thought about breaking this up, but this is why I didn't. And this is why this is big. And for a reviewer, you kind of have to know that, okay, this is going to take a little bit longer, right? This pull request is going to take me a little bit longer to review. As a code review author as well, there are times where like you create a big, huge pull request, and it is possible to split that pull request up into multiple pull requests. But you've already like made 20 commits and it's all in the same, it's all packaged together. And my advice for developers in that situation is to get really good at using repository, especially Git. If your team is using Git, definitely invest some time into like becoming a Git master, like being really good with those Git commands so that you can break up, if you get into that situation, you can break up your code accordingly and open up pull requests accordingly, and that sort of thing. But it takes practice and it takes experience, and you're not always able to solve this problem. And if you can't, if you end up with a really large PR, then, just kind of justify it, justify why you made that decision.
Great. Another question from Luan. Is there any recommendation for approvals, for example, 2 approvals, different team sizes, or even a security champion, like a process of approval template?
I think there's 2 different questions here, right? There's one about the process of approval template, and there's also like the number of approvals, right? Yeah, so each team is, I try to keep my advice as like general as possible. Each team should decide what works for them. I've never used like a process of approval template, mainly because I've always worked on products where like, there's a plethora of edge cases that you have to consider. And I think a template or a checklist, a code review checklist, might give you like a false sense of security. Like let's say you have like 10 things on this code review checklist, but there are some other edge cases or corner cases that you have to think about outside of that checklist, in order to like consider whether or not this code change is really good. And then in terms of like how many approvers that you need for each pull request, each team should choose what works best for them. I've always been on teams that have, required 1 or 2 reviewers. I have heard of other teams that are working on more critical products that, maybe they have a threshold of only senior engineers can review this, or only principal engineers can review this. That's not an optimal situation. But if, some systems really are that critical. And of course, like if your software is like life, impacting, like if you are writing software that's going to go on a spaceship, probably you need to be a little bit more strict with your review process than a lot of the things that I'm suggesting.
Yeah, that's a good recommendation. Thank you, Luan. We have another question from Andre. Sometimes we're eager to review every line of a pull request and end up asking a lot of questions and requests for change. What would be your advice on this? How much can someone review until it becomes too much? And this connects a little bit to what you said, right? So the dialogue and the iterations, which sometimes get a little bit too much. So is any rule of thumb here?
Yeah, so I think it's important to consider whether your feedback is objective or subjective, right? If your feedback is objective, meaning like the code that you're reviewing has flaws and it has defects, it's very important to, put all the comments that you can on there, because, you can't, you just can't push code with defects. It's not something that it's not a situation that you want your team to get in. And then understand which comments of yours are subjective. Like maybe you're just being nitpicky about like variable names or readability, and consider whether or not it's necessary for your teammate to address those. And you have to consider a lot of things in this situation, like who is the person that's authored the code. Like maybe it's a junior engineer and you want to really mentor them, and help them improve their skills. Or maybe it's a senior engineer and they have, and you have a good relationship with them, but they can do better, or that they kind of like glossed over this particular detail. Then it's important to add all those comments there as well. But at the end of the day, it's important to be pragmatic, right? I think it's important to not be a perfectionist. I think if you should, the code quality that gets contributed into the system should be like maybe one step above the code quality of the existing system. You're not going to refactor the whole entire system every change and improve the code quality dramatically on every change, but just make it a little bit better, right? Because if you're adding code to the system or modifying code, but by definition, it's getting harder to maintain because there's more code there. So you need to like raise the bar, the code quality bar just a little bit with every change. But if you demand perfection on every change, your team's not going to ship anything. So just kind of, it takes experience to know, like, there's not a objective concrete answer here. You just kind of have to consider those trade-offs when you're reviewing the code.
Fantastic. Do you think it's important for the author of the pull request to respond to all reviewer comments? Asks Christopher.
Yes, definitely. I think it's important to at least respond. I think it just kind of shows that you're listening to them. I found that, when I get a code review comment, I can, their comment is going to fall into like one of 3 buckets, right? It's either going to be they're correct, or what they're saying is subjective and debatable, or what they're saying is incorrect. And in all 3 situations, I tend to listen and address their comments. So if they're correct, obviously I implement their piece of feedback. If it's debatable, I try to respond to them saying, hey, like, I understand what you're trying to say. This is why I did it in this way. And I try to find like maybe a common ground. And then there's the third scenario, like maybe somebody commented on my pull request and they're incorrect, or they're just completely wrong. And this is like a very uncommon thing that I recommend, or something that I recommend that most people don't, is you should listen to them anyway, right? And you kind of like look it upon yourself and say, okay, this person commented on my pull request, but they were wrong. But people aren't just blatantly wrong most of the time, right? You have to consider why they left that piece of feedback. And most of the time it's due to an ambiguity, or a lack of clarity in my own code. So by listening to them, it kind of opens up my perspective to say, hey, maybe I did something that was unclear, or maybe my code is confusing. And it almost, and in many of the cases, I find that that's the case. And then I address their comment and maybe I make a change. I think when you do this, and then when you do this, when you like look at yourself and listen to them, it really shows the other person, hey, like I'm listening to what you're saying. And I'm going to take your feedback and embrace your feedback and then incorporate it. And then in the future, that reviewer is probably going to be like, honestly, they're going to be less nitpicky about me, or they're going to like, they're going to trust me a lot more. And a lot of their comments are going to over time be like less and less invasive, maybe, or maybe they'll be less strict just because I'm showing that I'm listening to everything they're saying. Yeah.
Fantastic tips, Curtis. So another few questions. We have an amazing number of questions from our audience. Thank you so much, guys, for sending these to us. Any tips on how to respond to someone who has given you a particularly unhelpful, harsh review? Love this question.
Yeah, this is a good question. I think the word harsh is a little bit sorry, I'm just trying to go through my notes here. So the word harsh kind of like puts me off a bit. If it's harsh and it's actually mean, or somebody's being like abusive, like then it's it's time to talk to somebody, right? I mean, you don't want to be in that. Nobody wants to be in that situation. But maybe unhelpful is a little bit more common. So I guess going forward, I can assume that this person is coming across as harsh, maybe, or maybe they're just being unhelpful. So it's kind of goes back to the mindset. I kind of usually give them the benefit of the doubt, like, hey, written communication, a lot of context gets lost, especially, we've all been texting. We've been texting our friends or texting somebody, and a lot of context gets lost there. So sometimes that happens in code review comments as well. So I give them the benefit of the doubt, like, hey, like, maybe you were trying to be straightforward with me, but you came across as a little mean. And a lot of times what I do is I read their comments in monotone. So I imagine that they're talking to me verbally in like a steady voice. I don't imagine that they're like yelling at me or anything. They're just maybe just talking like we're having a conversation now, the same level and pace of like my voice that I've been speaking for this entire like conversation. It's just like very, very steady. So I imagine they're just speaking to me. That kind of like lowers my desire to like get defensive about it. And then I try to really focus on the objective, like, okay, what are they saying here? What are they trying to say? And once I get to that, I say, okay, I consider it, okay, why did they say it? And is it true or not? And is it something that I really need to address? And most of the time it is. Like most of the time I figure out like, okay, there was an ambiguity in my code. There was a lack of clarity in my code. So I'm going to take this comment. I'm going to figure out what this person is saying, and I'm going to address it. So I think, and then maybe, I don't know, send them my course to teach them how to teach them how to review better. Because I actually, I'm saying that as like a shameless plug, but I'm also saying that as this is something that we should be talking about more, and I think this is something that we should be training our developers to do more, is to have empathic and kind reviews to others.
Fantastic. A really upvoted question. Any tips to manage time between working on your tickets and reviewing other pull requests?
Yeah, definitely. Code reviews take a lot of time. And when you're operating in a team lead kind of role, then, you have all your time and priorities being pulled in different directions. So it's important to prioritize your time accordingly. I think, you have a lot of different projects going on, and you can't review every single pull request. What I like is like GitHub and Slack has an integration, and you can like set up a Slack channel where all the comments and all the pull requests, every event that happens on a pull request goes through this Slack channel. And a lot of times what I would do is I would like scan the Slack channel just to like see, okay, is there anything that like needs my attention? Because you don't want somebody to push out some code that like doesn't work, or you don't want anything to break. So just kind of like getting an understanding of like, okay, this is the small thing. I can let somebody else review this, or I can let somebody else give code review feedback here because, worst case scenario is not that bad. But then if something is touching a really critical part of the system, then that's when I say, okay, I need to like go into this code review and actually review this thing because it could break the entire thing, right? And so just kind of like choosing where I can simply scan. Maybe I just look at the comments and maybe I'll look at the description and scan it real quick. And then I picking and choosing the situations where I really need to dive in and review some code. And I think that's a common mistake is that like when people get into a team lead role, they try to review every single thing, but that's just it's not feasible and it doesn't scale with your time. So you have to kind of empower your other teammates to do this. And also invest more time into other parts of your delivery cycle, right? Maybe invest more time in getting more robust tests or speeding up your tests or improving your test coverage. That'll help prevent defects. And then detecting defects, you want to make sure you have appropriate monitoring and metrics and alarms so that you know immediately if something's happening in production, if something is broken. And also speed to mitigation. Like if something happens, how are we able to quickly mitigate a defect or an outage or whatever that may be? So investing your time into building a robust system in different areas outside of code review as well.
Fantastic. We're getting here to the end, almost the end of our Q&A. So I'm going to select a few more questions. Ruslan asks, what's your opinion on blind code reviews?
Blind code reviews. I have never actually heard of this. Is this when like you review code and you don't know who the author is?
I think so. You get a piece of code and you don't know where it came from. Yeah,
I've heard of this. I haven't really put much thought into this. From my thoughts, my quick thoughts now, I can see definitely some advantages and disadvantages. An advantage is that you're more likely to look at the situation objectively and evaluate the situation objectively and make objective comments. I think a disadvantage is that sometimes code review feedback really is subjective, and that subjectivity can be valuable. So, for example, if I know the person that wrote this code is a junior engineer, maybe I'll invest more time into explaining why, giving the why behind my code review feedback, or maybe I'll spend more time in mentoring them and helping them level up. Or if I know that I'm reviewing the code of somebody more senior, I can just be like really brief in my code review feedback because I don't want to waste my time, and like I know that they understand the principles I'm talking about. So definitely trade-offs with blind code review.
I was just actually checking, and I was wrong. Blind code review is when you're reviewing a system you're not familiar with, which everything you said actually applies to that. So but yeah, it's jumping on top of a project and reviewing it.
Definitely. That's so the quick answer is that that's simply going to take more time. It's very difficult to review some code where you don't understand the underlying system and the underlying product, and you really have to have an understanding of those things. So over time, your team should be actively improving your team members' ability to understand those different components of the system and get a deep understanding there. But I have been in situations where I just kind of have to do it. Like there's nobody else. Maybe there's like, we have a legacy product and there's 400 developers who have never seen the thing. And I think it's important for the engineers to emphasize to their managers, to their organization, that these code reviews are simply going to take longer. I mean, they're going to take a very, very long time, and you have to really consider that and estimate accordingly.
Fantastic. I'll choose one final one, guys, but we have so much engagement. So happy about this. So Christopher asks, if a feature was written in pair coding session, do you feel it is still necessary to subject the code to a normal amount of scrutiny in a PR?
Each team should do what's best for them. I think that, I was talking earlier about the trade-offs between pair programming and asynchronous code review. It really depends on the level of risk you're willing to accommodate and the maturity of the product as well. I think if you have a pair programming session with a few engineers and they're working on a straightforward problem, and they evaluated different solutions and evaluated the trade-offs of those solutions and came to one solution, and then just did it. Probably no need for an asynchronous review. If it's something where you're modifying a critical part of the system and it's two junior engineers, and they want some feedback from a more senior engineer, then I think it would definitely be a good idea to bring in that asynchronous reviewer. So really just depends. These are tools that organizations should evaluate and use depending on their use case.
Fantastic. You know what? If we have a few more minutes, this audience has been so good to send us these questions. Christopher asks again, what do you think about code suggestions when reviewing? How often do you think it's good to use them?
So a suggestion, like maybe a suggested change. I think
so. Yeah.
GitHub has
like
like
fixes,
suggested
change. And such. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's important. So GitHub has a suggested change where you can like automatically make the commit for somebody. I think it's good. It's good to help the author see exactly what you mean by suggesting that change. I also think that you should include a reason why. So maybe like you're changing a variable from one thing to another, and that's a very common suggested change comment. But I think you should also include a reason why, even when you're making those suggested changes. And a lot of my code review feedback, if it's in the subjective realm, like maybe if it's a flaw or a defect, I kind of just say directly like, hey, this is a flaw because we're going to break this component, or we're going to miss this edge case, or we're going to raise this exception. But if it's a subjective comment, I would say, a lot of my comments are suggestions anyway. Like, hey, maybe a reader reading this might have to read this a few times because the logic is convoluted. I might recommend restructuring your code to something that looks more like this. And so that's kind of a suggestive comment as well. I don't know if that was like what they were asking, but yeah.
I think it's a good answer. Thank you, Christopher. And last but not least, last question we have is from Takuya. Do you use any automatic review system prior to the actual standard code review?
Yep. We have like pre-commit hooks usually. So like you can have pre-commit hooks that like automatically format your code, automatically style your code, and also check for there are some like if there are debugger statements or print statements, or whatever you want to check for. You can also, we have actually a couple of scripts that implement like subjective or like opinionated preferences based on code quality. A lot of things like check style, like Java's check style, you can enforce those subjective preferences as well. So a lot of pre-commit hooks, very valuable for maintaining that code quality.
Okay. Awesome. So we have a few more questions. I think we answered some of these as we went through our session. So I think, if we're all good, I'm really thankful for all these amazing questions, guys. It was really a productive session. Curtis, it was wonderful to chat with you today. Eloisa,
Sure.
let's close it out.
Yeah, I wanted to just quickly mention, like, I'm active on like Twitter and LinkedIn, and my messages are open, my email's open. So if anybody has like questions they want to write to me, I try to respond in however, as quickly as I can.
Yeah, thank you so much, Curtis and Jaime, for such an interesting, honest talk. It was so great to have you, Curtis, in our live talks. We love discussing code reviews, and so does our audience from what we can see. So thank you, everyone, for all these questions that you've sent us. You've made it fun and interactive for us. And we couldn't get to every single question in the time that we have, but I would ask you to please post them in our community. So all of these panelists are there, plus 500 other developers worldwide. I'm going to share some of these links with you here. So I think you can see them now. Yeah, okay. So you can check us out and follow us. The community is just community.codacy.com. That's where, if we haven't answered your question, or if you remember something else, do post it there, because we're going to be watching and we can continue this conversation, online. But thank you everyone for coming. And we'll have a recording of this so you can look back if you missed anything, or for people who didn't make it today, there's going to be a recording. And if you want to stay tuned for more live talks, you can follow Codacy's Twitter and LinkedIn here. And if you want to learn more about code reviews, you also have Curtis's social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Medium. And there's a link here to the video course as well. So you can find a lot of information and all over his channels. I'm sure you'll find it useful. And yeah, I hope to see you all at our next Codacy webinar. And if you can, take a quick second to answer the survey at the very end of this. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Curtis.
Cool. Thank you so much, Eloisa and Jaime. This was a great discussion, and I really enjoyed participating. Thanks.
Awesome.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.